Yeah, in fact, I think I would second all three books actually. Especially one and Wins Fire Up on the Deep. So let me start by thanking Sylvia, Ann, and David for organizing this event, and especially for inviting me to be on this panel. I think the topic, Future Now, kind of pretty much captures one of science fiction's main side effects, which is it makes our world science fictional, right? Like, as Zach was saying, people read science fiction and they go out to implement it. So the world it appears more and more science fictional. In fact, one of the speakers in the morning said something like, this isn't science fiction, it actually exists. I think in the future we're going to hear, this isn't science fictional, it can't exist. You know, They're kind of reverse, in a sense, the technologies that we are seeing are so science fictional that it's becoming difficult for science fiction writers to imagine things that are truly out there, right? Because technology can do it now. Sometimes science fiction is described as a literature of wonder or the literature of estrangement, but that's describing science fiction in terms of its effects, not in terms of its causes. If you ask why writers write science fiction, at least in my case, I don't set out to create wonder or to estrange people. It's more in terms of I'm discontent with the way the world is. There's some aspect of the world that displeases me. I'm not happy about it. So when I write about a new world, there are some things I will not change, and there are some things that I will change. And if you look at a science fiction writer's novel, and you figure out what he changes or what she changed and what she didn't change, you can often figure out what they are discontented about. For example, in my novel, The Beast with 9 billion feet, I imagined a world in which there were people had begun to build artificial islands. So these, natural man-made islands, and they're not building like a few dozen. They're building hundreds of them. I was trying to imagine a world what would happen if we had hundreds of these new places. We had a market in places, for example. So you're not condemned to live out your life where you were born. And one of the reasons that this thing pleased me, the reason that I wanted a world like that, was that I spent most of my life as a kind of immigrant, a perpetual immigrant. I grew up in Tanzania, then I shifted to India, then I came to went to the United States for my studies, and then I'm back in India now. And all my life I have dealt with customs and visa forms and statement of purposes and things like that. And you would like to have a world in which travel was much easier, motion is much simpler. And if you didn't like a place, you could simply leave, You could vote with your feet rather than vote with your genetics, for example, or your passport. So in my world, I created a world in which that was possible and I could explore it. In other words, I'm thinking of science fiction as the literature of discontent. Unlike other literature, other kinds of literature, science fiction is largely focused on what writers don't like or like about their worlds. All fiction, I think, tries to substitute causes with reasons. So in science fiction too, you find the same thing. You find, because a lot of technological causes have come into the world, we find a new kind of set of reasons coming into the world. But ultimately, I think science fiction is special in that it is a literature of discontent, and it addresses the discontent we feel with the world. And I'll end by saying that one item which we don't see in science fiction today, and which motivated me personally to start writing science fiction, is that it is starved in people. We don't find there's a kind of people are invisible in science fiction. In the following sense, for example, science fiction can imagine magic bullets, technological magic bullets, things that fly faster than the speed of light, robots that can think, things like that. But science fiction has a really hard time imagining mass social movements. For example, non-violent movement. Science fiction can't imagine that. Science fiction couldn't imagine microfinance. Science fiction didn't imagine the internet until it was fairly late in the day, right? Science fiction can't imagine something like the palliative care movement, in which thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, are becoming doctors, do-it-yourself healthcare, for example. So whenever you have mass social movements, you find that science fiction usually retreats to the usual tropes of heroes, villains, and that kind of thing, right? The standard plot lines. Imagining changes through mass social movements is not within the reach of, it's not something that science fiction tries. So one thing I'm trying to do in my own fiction is to move towards a science fiction that takes people much more seriously, takes makers more seriously. And that's one of the reasons I'm here, to see a mass social movement developing here. It's a hacker movement, the maker movement. And I'm very curious to see how it's going to play out in the fiction of the future.
Thank you so much for your inspiring publications. I just wanted to start with a really big question, which I think relates to all of our projects in the room, which is the extent to which you can actively design the future. Is that something that you think is possible?
Yeah, I think we definitely can construct futures. In science fiction, you find, for example, people like H.G. Wells or Jules Verne were amazingly accurate in terms of the kind of worlds that they saw, especially Jules Verne. If you read his Paris in the 20th century, they're written somewhere in 19, in fact, I think it was 1905. It's absolutely amazing the kind of thing that he foresaw, mass transportation, the kind of fuel that we would use, the kind of buildings we would have. Or you read someone like Kafka, and you get an idea of the social worlds in which we live, highly regimented, bureaucratized. It kind of foresees something like the concentration camps, right? It foresaw the concentration camps. In a sense, I think so. It is possible, not so much in terms of design as much as anticipate, perhaps. And of course, they do have a design aspect when writers talk about it. People feel inspired to go out and build some of these things. So in that sense, they are design. So yes, that's shocking.
Okay, I'm going to try to throw something else out, which is the question about fear and desire. I think a lot of the science fiction books that have been mentioned and stories that, and also a lot of the stuff that is happening around us today, I mean also in the Maker Carnival, and has an element of fear, an element of terror that maybe is sort of just bubbling there under the surface. I mean, of course, there's nothing that seems so terrifying when you walk outside and everyone's being friendly, but it's not that hard to sort of speculate out and say where this is leading, especially for someone who is immersed in the world of science fiction, is a story that is quite terrifying. And at the same time, there seems to be an unconscious, or maybe sometimes conscious, desire for that same future, that same, and a lot of that has to do with the transformation of the species, the loss of human agency, and these sort of things. So if I can, I know this is not quite a question, but if I can ask you to just speak when you think about your own work and how the future plays, if you can think about this mixture of terror and fear and also seduction and desire.
I think when Woody Allen was asked, is sex dirty? He said, if it's done right. It's a bit like that. I think if you do technology right, it should be fearful. It should be really fearsome, right? It should cause us to tremble. Because good technology is powerful technology, and powerful technology is dangerous. So I think it's a natural response, and I think I think we have always found ways to handle technology. And I don't think that's going to be different in the future. So for example, I asked you about DIY biology. What will happen if people use it for terrorism? Personally, it's not a concern. My reasoning is that if we ever become that good at biology, even if we do invent viruses in some lab, we'll also be able to invent antidotes equally easily, right? I think that the future is not going to be so scary that we only have problems. We'll also be able to generate solutions equally quickly. Excuse me. So in that sense, yeah, there is always fear and trembling, but it's something that we can handle. The second thing is, I think I see this part of technology as a positive force in the following sense. I live in this suburb in Charlottesville, Virginia, and it's an extremely safe place, right? It's a kind of place where you can actually leave your door unlocked, right? Because there's been no crime there for the last 10 years, at least where I live. But everything is extremely safe. The playgrounds are rubberized, right? The kids don't play in the roads because a car might come in 10 years from now and run them over, right? Everything is watched and monitored. There are societies for this, societies for that. We can't leave our garbage out, right? Because the bears might come, right? Seriously. We have to sign all sorts of conventions. And it reminds me of Cavafy's poem, Waiting for the Barbarians, where he talks about this Roman Empire and the senators are waiting, and they're waiting for the barbarians, right? Because the civilization has gotten so safe, so boring, that you want death. And I think that these hacker movements, these mass movements, provide that risk that humanity needs to keep moving ahead. And if you take it away, we end up degenerate, utterly safe and utterly dead.
wanted to connect this back to a point Anil made at the beginning of our conversation about how the days of the wildest imaginings of sci-fi writers now may be passing, and explorations of the near future are becoming very common, possibly more popular. I just wondered how that relates to this whole conversation about fear. Is that a way of actually allaying fear or confronting it further, that that it's becoming more common to explore a world a few years down the line rather than light centuries ahead?
I think one curious pattern that I'm seeing is the worship of superheroes. So, for example, Hollywood movies are dominated now by superheroes, right? We also find it's dominated by vampires and zombies. And I think people are beginning to project their fears into bodies, right? Either they want to transform human beings into things that aren't there. For example, vampires are immortal, they never age, right? So we transform our fears of aging into creatures that don't age and can fly and are extremely beautiful, things like that. Or we transpose our fears onto zombies and can just slash and kill them with no ethical consequences whatsoever, right? No one stands around and discusses, is it ethical to kill a zombie, right? Because zombie is not discussing that, right? So I think one thing that science fiction is doing is to transpose its fears into contexts that are familiar. You get a monster and you do something with the monster, right? But in terms of the larger problem as to are we running out of things to imagine, I think it's probably temporary at this stage. There seems to be a kind of a disconnect between what literature is doing and what movies are making. Right? Movies are still stuck very much in the 60s and 70s. The kind of stories that we are seeing in the theaters are really from fiction from the 60s and 70s. For example, a lot of Philip Dick movies are being made, and they're all written in the 70s, right? So a lot of the stuff that's appearing in the 80s and 90s and later on. For example, how would you make a movie about makers, for example? It'll be fascinating. Cory Doctorow has written a book on makers. The question is, how long will it take Hollywood to actually make a movie on makers? Probably by 2050 or so, right? When it's a well-established phenomenon. So I think there's a disconnect, and perhaps we need some time to figure out to bridge this disconnect. But fundamentally, as a science fiction writer, I'm hopeful. So.